When I was growing up, I went on this retreat. It was called a lock-in, and we started at Saturday evening, 4 or 5 o'clock, and we went all night until early Sunday morning. Whoever was in charge of this retreat has earned heaven for taking care of all of us kids all night like that. But we stayed up all night, and it was a youth retreat. It was great fun. On one of these particular retreats, I went to like 2 of them ever, and on one of them, a cousin of mine was on this retreat. And he's somebody that I've always looked up to. He's a few years older than me. He's the coolest guy I've ever known in my life. And he took no lip from anybody. Super confident, super sure of himself, and he liked me. So I was a fan of all of that. So he happened to go on this retreat. It was maybe the only religious thing I've really ever done with him other than kind of running into him at Mass. And part of this retreat, we had adoration going on. And there was a deacon that took the monstrance, which is that kind of brilliant piece of metalwork that holds the Eucharist in the center. And we were all in a big circle in this gym. And this deacon was walking around with the monstrance. And when he came in front of my cousin bowed his face to the ground. And I was shocked. I had heard my whole growing up life that the Eucharist was Jesus, and that when I received the Eucharist at Mass, it was Jesus' body and blood. But that moment hit me that this was more than just something we talk about, but this is truly Him. And that night was the first time I ever experienced Eucharistic adoration, which is where Jesus in the monstrance there, we have it at Sacred Heart here in town at the Adoration Chapel, is exposed, and you get to pray there with him. And I remember crying and being just totally overwhelmed by that experience. As we go through life, I hope that every one of us has had a touchstone moment where we experienced God in an extremely powerful way. And I hope it's a moment that we go back to over and over again. In the first reading, Abram had God tell him, "You will get this promise. I'm going to make of you a great nation," and all the rest. This is even before he's changed his name to Abraham. And if you remember Abraham's story, he loses faith at some point. He kind of wavers on, is God really going to do all these things for me? And so he has a son, Ishmael, and there's all of that mess with it. But if we keep going back to those touchstone moments in life, no matter where our faith is in a given moment, as we waver, as we rock on the ship of life, we can remember that God has been faithful and good. Think of this transfiguration experience that the disciples had with Jesus. None of them really expected that to happen, and yet all of a sudden they see Moses and Elijah. We've heard these stories so many times we can start to forget how impressive that is. That Jesus' clothes transform and he's shining brighter than the sun. And Moses and Elijah, the 2 great figures, the heroes of Israel's history, are right there. And yet they go down from that mountain and end up being confused because Jesus is talking about, don't talk about this until after I rise from the dead. And his disciples end up failing whenever Jesus needs them most. They all run away. Peter denies him. But what would have happened if they kept going back to those kinds of moments, those experiences? In Acts of the Apostles, there's actually a recall of that whole transfiguration experience. Peter recalls that moment to those present who he's preaching to. I would contend because that was such a transformative moment for him. That was a moment he had to keep going back to in the midst of the suffering and difficulties of life. And for me, that moment, that first time in Eucharistic adoration, that first time when I saw my cousin bowing down to somebody for probably the only time in his life, has stuck with me. And in the midst of doubts, that's a moment I continue to go back to. In Ignatian spirituality, it's talking about when you're in moments of desolation, where your heart is empty, where you don't feel the connection with God, and sometimes in Lent, when your penances are feeling a little bit heavy, you kind of start to scratch your head and think, why did I give this up again? Why am I doing this? We have to go back to those moments and remember that God is faithful. God wants to do something powerful again in your life. And so I'd invite you to really take, again, seriously, those moments in the past where you remember strongly you had a powerful experience with Christ, and remember his faithfulness, so that no matter what trials that come along in life, you can lean in on those.